Welcome to Breakpoint this week. I'm Shane Morris, here with John Stonestreet to talk about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. Follow the stories that we're talking about here on Breakpoint this week. Go to breakpoint.org, where you'll find commentaries every day and resources to help you live and think like a Christian in the current culture. John, I've got stories in front of me right now about life on Venus, Middle East peace deals, genocide in Africa, Americans not knowing anything about the Holocaust, and even a boycott against Netflix for exploiting underage actresses. And if you don't want to start with any of these, we could always start with Joe Biden playing Despacito on his phone at the Hispanic Heritage event. So your pick.
I have not seen that headline. Is that a true story?
It actually happened. He was about to come out on stage, and they clapped, and then nothing happened. And then somebody backstage was helping him get Despacito queued up on his phone, and then he comes out and just plays it in front of the microphone and kind of dances back and forth a little bit, and that was his kickoff for the rally.
Wow. Yeah, let's go to another story then.
Okay. I got to say, though, I did say, in the interest of being fair to both parties, that this is pretty much on par with the Cinco de Mayo taco bowl photo op that President Trump did a while back. So I think as far as awkward goes here, as far as cringe goes, we're equal on both sides.
Okay. Yeah. Again, let's keep going.
Let's hit the first story I want to talk about this week, John, and you and I were discussing beforehand, because it just relates to so much that we have covered on this program and on Breakpoint, is the ongoing situation in a number of places in Africa with regard to persecution against Christians. So we followed this story of persecution in Nigeria by Boko Haram factions and Fulani herdsmen for quite a while against Christians there. And watchdog organizations like Open Doors USA have given us a broad picture of what's happening there. According to a new report from the Barnabas Fund, the ancient church there in Ethiopia has fallen under coordinated killings targeting Christians from a wide range of ethnicities, including Oromo Christians. And this persecution is carried out primarily by Islamic extremists from a male youth movement. It involves these just terrifying tactics, door-to-door attacks on Christian households. Extremists arrive in cars armed with guns and machetes and swords and spears, and they'll actually seek out and slaughter Christians. And according to this report, children were forced in some instances to witness their parents being murdered. And so this is the emerging theater of persecution there in Africa right now. And it's just a part of a much bigger and more horrifying picture of what's happening there, primarily at the hands of Islamic extremists.
You know, there's been some remarkable progress made in the last few years in terms of defeating ISIS in the Middle East and finally, kind of getting on top of what has been an incredibly destructive force. The problem is that by and large, what we're seeing is that this is moving to Africa. And we're seeing it certainly now emerging in Ethiopia. And that's what makes this such an incredible story. Ethiopia, I mean, I was just reading this past week, reading through Acts with my kids and just reading the early chapters of Philip being sent to share the gospel. That's where this church dates from. This church dates literally from the earliest time of the church. I mean, Philip gets sent to a eunuch traveling through, and the Ethiopian eunuch, the famous story, what must I do what prevents me from being baptized here? And Philip says, nothing, just believe. And then go back, and this is the start of the Ethiopian church. It's a stunning history. It's not unlike Thomas being sent, to various places, and how that ended up with a church that dates that back, to such the days after Christ ascension. Right. It's just really stunning. But we have, as the center of Islamic extremism gets run out of the Middle East, it's heading to Africa, and we have already spent an awful lot of time talking about the major front of this over the last couple months has been Nigeria. This past week, I spent on Wednesday, I joined a panel of folks calling the U.S. government calling the U.S. government to act on this and do something about it. The scale of the slaughter of Christians, the abductions, the violence against Christians, at the hands of, it's really, both Boko Haram and Fulani militants, and Christians are there in the middle. The scale of this is being called genocide, and genocide's a carefully defined word. This is something we've talked about a couple times on Breakpoint. You don't throw around that term when you talk in official capacity. You're talking about the intentional aiming at an entire ethnic group to either basically keep them from reproducing or to end their lives altogether. And what's happening in Nigeria against Nigerian Christians is just, in the northern part of that country, is just really, really stunning. To listen to Stephen Anada, who is the head of an organization called the International Committee on Nigeria, or ICON, who hosted this gathering. To hear him just kind of sum it up, it was overwhelming. To hear the Honorable Frank Wolf, former U.S. Congressman from Virginia, who has spent so much of his career championing religious liberty both here and abroad, and especially the international cause, so much so that a religious freedom bill was named after him. He's now out of Congress. And then also representative from Chris Smith's office. Frank Wolf called Chris Smith the most impressive champion for religious liberty of the last 30 years. If Frank Wolf calls you an impressive champion for religious liberty, that kind of doubles the impact. It was unbelievable. And they called unequivocally for a special U.S. envoy, such as what was done in other countries under the Bush administration. Tulsi Gabbard joined this gathering. It was fascinating. Just recently, a Democratic nominee for president. Couldn't disagree with her more on all kinds of things, including just basic religious belief. She's a Hindu. And yet, she was unequivocal in her support for Christians being persecuted in Nigeria. So to see this story pop up in Ethiopia, what my comments to this gathering, Shane, included, look, this is the conflict in Nigeria. The attack on Christians goes back about a decade. And it's as recent as this week. One of the remarkable resources that ICON has on their website, which is, by the way, called silentslaughternigeria.com, silentslaughternigeria.com. They have a calendar. It's like a calendar that you'd have on your iCal or your Microsoft calendar or Google Cal or something like that. And it just goes day by day, and it lists and it documents the sources for their listings of the number of Christians that have been killed, persecuted, or abducted. So just for context, in the last week, over 20 Christians have been killed and over 60 have been abducted just in the last week in the country of Nigeria. This calendar only goes back to Christmas time of 2019.
Yeah.
And the sheer scale of this is absolutely stunning. To see this now move into Ethiopia, and of course we know this, that Islamic State and Islamic radicals, they're not always directly connected. The loose connections, the ability to kind of, there's that classic business book, The Starfish and the Spider. Islamic militants aren't spider organizations where if you cut off the head, it goes away. There's starfish organizations where if you cut off an arm, it grows again. To see this male youth movement, which that's a whole nother point, isn't it, Shane? Like Islamic extremism rides the backs of young, aimless men.
Yeah.
That is an important detail here. To see this spread to Ethiopia with such a historic church is tragic, especially after what we've seen in Nigeria. And we want people to come to Breakpoint. We'll link you to the work of ICON. They're doing fantastic work to document this. But when you see it all together, your initial response is, could this possibly be real? Could this possibly be true? The scale of this is stunning. And if this is true, in fact, we had some of these questions come in, Shane. If this is really true, why are we not hearing about it? And that's the great question.
Yeah, that's the incredible part about it, John. The Barnabas Fund is reporting, 500 Christians killed in Ethiopia since June. It's incredible how quiet things have been about that we haven't heard about this. And it's in many ways this kind of decentralized starfish style genocide, if you want to call it that, is it's much harder to grapple with than the kind of genocide that we see. And we have applied that word to what the Chinese are doing with the Uyghur Muslim minority there in several provinces, because that's very centralized and it's very hard to hide. I mean, it involves actual concentration camps, whereas this type of genocide is it's hit and run. It's involved. It's primarily perpetrated by a decentralized organization. In some cases, private actors who are motivated by Islamic extremism, but otherwise they don't have there's no hierarchy. There's no one calling the shots or anything. It's just a hit and run attack style on in a completely unprovoked basis on communities that aren't expecting it. And that's why it's this situation is so intractable in Africa, and why it's so important, I think, for us to expose that situation. Because at least when it comes to Nigeria, John, one of the things that I remember reading about was that the government there has very much turned a blind eye to this sort of thing. And part of that has to do with the biases of high officials, some of whom are, hail from these ethnic groups that are actually perpetrating persecution against Christians. And so you have an unwillingness by officials who are dragging their feet to enforce the law and to put a stop to this kind of stuff. And that's what makes it so difficult to deal with. It's not like a situation with a bad faith government, something like North Korea or China. We could have there could be diplomatic dealings that would target that directly. In this case, it's much more complicated. And so, I mean,
this is why Congressman Frank Wolf's suggestion that we need a special envoy is actually just this is where change happens, when the power of the U.S. government steps up and goes, no, hey, Nigeria, this is going to stop. Right. In other words, Nigeria, the Nigerian government has had a chance to stop this, and they have chosen to actually look the other way for all kinds of internal convenience. So you're not going to get the internal pressure on the Fulani militants or on the Boko Haram to stop. You have to have that external incentive placed there. And, this is a role that the U.S. government has played. And let me also say, too, Shane, that this is one of the reasons that Christians in the United States should fight to preserve religious liberty. Because who else has a special envoy for religious liberty that's going to bring the power of one of the most powerful nations in the world to bear on behalf of persecuted religious minorities? It's pretty much America and nobody else. And that's one of the things, as much, again, as I disagree with Tulsi Gabbard on almost everything politically, this is a place we have in common. And she was very clear. There is a role for the U.S. government. There is a role for the state to protect persecuted religious minorities. And pretty much if we're not going to do it, nobody else is going to do it. And by the way, the other participant in that, who was bigger than all of us, of course, was Benjamin Watson, the former NFL player and Super Bowl champion. And he brought his influence and his platform to bear on this, which is really remarkable, too.
Well, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back to talk about more of the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective, particularly a genocide past, now that we've talked about genocide present. Stay with us. We're back on Breakpoint this week, covering the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. I'm Shane Morris, and I'm here with John Stonestreet. And John, we just talked about unfolding genocide in Africa. We mentioned also genocide that's happening in China right now. And these are current examples of the kind of horrors that were just shockingly common throughout the 20th century. And of course, the genocide of genocides, the one that we all think about or should think about, is the Holocaust, the massive genocide that the Nazis perpetrated against the Jewish people and a number of other ethnic minorities in Europe, leading up to and then during World War II. And we just got a poll out this week that was tremendously startling to me, John. And it has to do with how well Americans, particularly Americans under 40, understand the Holocaust and what happened and the details of that greatest horror of the 20th century. A survey released Wednesday concluded that U.S. adults under 40 lack basic knowledge of the Holocaust, which left 6 million Jews dead during World War II. The 50-state poll commissioned by the nonprofit Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany found that 63%, John, of U.S. adults between 18 and 39 years old didn't know that 6 million Jews were killed during the Holocaust. And 36% actually believed that 2 million or fewer Jews were killed. And 48% of respondents nationally couldn't even name one of the 40,000 concentration camps and ghettos in Europe during the 30s and 40s. And of course, the one that comes to mind immediately should be Auschwitz. But this tremendous number of respondents couldn't even name that.
This is where this story is where the uh, the whole backdrop of Americans not teaching history well goes from being funny to being dangerous, right? I mean, it's somewhere
That's a
funny,
good way to put it.
when you see the average person on the street, when Jimmy Kimmel stops them and asks them kind of basic history questions or something like that, that they're just ridiculous, right? Like they have no idea what they're talking about, and they say really funny things. It's another thing then when you go
What
to
did you
what we
think
saw.
when George Washington crossed the Rubicon? And they'll give some sort of, intelligent sounding answer.
Yeah, because nobody wants to feel stupid, and so that
Right.
adds to the whole hilarity. But then you move on to what we've seen in the last several months, in which the statues of Frederick Douglass, the statues of Abraham Lincoln, actual people who fought blood, sweat, and tears to end slavery and the scourge of slavery in so many different ways, are being canceled by activists who clearly don't know their history at all, and they can't actually then distinguish between heroes and villains, and they can't also understand people on their own terms and their own cultural settings, and that fact that nobody had claimed. And this also leads to the something we've talked about a lot, which is the chronological snobbery of, if I were back there, I would have been on the right side of history. You get into this, and let me just remind you what's happening in China right now, that Muslim Uyghurs are being loaded onto cars. Their hair is being used to sell beauty products. They're being forced into labor, forced labor, and they're being forced into infertility, forced sterilizations, and so on. Does any of this sound familiar? Loaded onto trains by the dozens and hundreds, and then sent to camps and forced to work for the profit of the government. Does any of this sound familiar? Well, it does, because it sounds like what happened in Germany in the Holocaust. What
But I imagine
happens?
it doesn't to a large percentage of Americans under 40.
Isn't that? Yeah, it doesn't for so many. It should, and it doesn't. And there's a reason cliches sometimes become cliches, and that's one of the cliches, right? Anybody who forgets history is condemned to repeat it. Well, there you go. It literally, what's happening to the Uyghurs goes unnoticed, and then we act shocked. Like, how can that be happening when we have all the historical precedent in the world to know what happens when totalitarian governments run up against somebody that is interfering with their vision of utopia? That's what happens. These people become expendable and actually obstacles to be removed.
I'll tell you the worst thing to forget about the Holocaust, John, is not even the numbers or the sheer scale of the horror. It's really forgetting that those who countenanced the rise of this regime in Germany in the 30s, those who sat by and watched it happen, and in some cases, even those who participated, they weren't demons. They weren't monsters. They were normal people. They were just like you and me in many respects. And they sat by and let 6 million people go to their deaths through horrific and barbaric means because, well, I mean, there are a lot of reasons. One of the reasons is that they didn't want to see. Another reason is that they liked the political reforms that were happening under Adolf Hitler and under the Nazis, and they felt the sense of pride and patriotism in their country again for the first time. And they turned a blind eye to it. And the point of that, John, the reason why it's so important to remember that ordinariness of the people who watched the Holocaust unfold right beneath their noses is that it can happen here too. It can happen under our noses. It can happen under the noses of any people in the world, because human nature hasn't changed. There's nothing especially dark about the nature of Germany in the 1930s as far as humanity is concerned. Certainly politically there are unique circumstances, but we're just the same as they were. We have the same kinds of prejudices and shortfallings and unwillingness to look evil in the eye. And because of that, we got to be on our guard. But we can't be on our guard if we think that the people who perpetrated the Holocaust are a race of inhuman monsters who have never before existed and will never exist again. It's not self-evident that stuff is monstrous to many people in the world. That's something they can countenance.
That brings up such an important point, Shane. And I was going to highlight one other thing, and now I'm going to highlight two other things just based on your observation. Is this it's bad enough to not know the history of the Holocaust. It's another thing to not know the history of what led up to it and what we learned from it. So leading up to it, I've just finished a book. It's going to be my recommendation for the week. It's the 75th anniversary edition of the definitive story of Sophie Scholl and the White Rose, a story that we talked about recently on Breakpoint that I talk about a lot. I'll get back to it in the recommendations. But the one of the things that I was reminded of, and I just hadn't maybe even realized and definitely had forgotten, the role that the Hitler Youth Movement in the 10 years prior to him taking power, the role that ended up playing in getting so many people to literally and figuratively walk lockstep with the Nazis and the Third Reich. When you win the hearts of children and the power of that strategy, you talk about a very tragic lesson to forget culturally, is when somebody goes after the kids, what the long-term consequences of that can be. And then also, you mentioned this kind of normalization. You mentioned this sort of a tendency to put the Nazis into a special camp of monster, as if they're fundamentally different than who we are as human beings and fallen. Wasn't that one of the lessons from Nuremberg, the trials afterwards? Wasn't that one of the things that you read in Viktor Frankl, or you read about in transcripts of the trials, when the Nazi war criminals are held accountable for what they did? And here you have these Jewish folks, or you have these stories of German leaders being brought into the United States so that their scientific expertise wouldn't go to the Russians, and they become integrated in human society. And that's something that you miss when you not only forget the Holocaust, but you forget everything around it. If we're forgetting the actual details of the Holocaust, like, hey, a group of people that were in the way of a utopian government vision were put into trains and loaded off to concentration. Like, if we can't remember that detail, we're not going to remember all the other details that are far more important even than the specific numbers themselves. How it happened, what we learn about the human condition, what does this tell us about who we are as human beings? This is really a big loss.
Well, there are other sobering details of Nuremberg that we need to keep in mind. And one of those, foremost in my mind, is the defense that some of the Nazi officials gave when they were.
Where does morality come from?
Where does morality come from? And then they also pointed back to the United States and the eugenics program that had already been underway in America, and said, look, you guys are doing forced sterilizations. You guys are practicing eugenics here. We learned from you. How can you sit there and preside over us and condemn us for what we did? You guys
I need to bring up this story, Shane, and we don't have it on the list of stories to talk about this week, but it's one that always gets all of our spidey senses tingling. It's an unproven allegation of a particular private ICE holding facility in Georgia, in which what we're hearing is forced hysterectomies, or patients that were given hysterectomies. Now, what we don't know right now is whether this is a rogue doctor, kind of like a Kermit Gosnell sort of figure, who apparently the doctor that apparently treats everything with a hysterectomy, is what this accusation is saying. Whether this is something that the center knew about and didn't do anything about, didn't really know about at all, whatever. This certainly doesn't seem to be a widespread policy of ICE. But what got all of our attentions at the Colson Center, what got all of our attentions around our editorial team, is we talk a lot about this history of eugenics and the American experience. Go get Jonah Goldberg's book, Liberal Fascism, and read chapter 6 about eugenics. Read The War Against the Weak by Edwin Black. This is part of our history. You want to lose sleep tonight, just Google it. Google eugenics in America prior to World War II. And what you'll see is the mayor of Chicago writing a note to Hitler congratulating him on the success of the eugenics programs and saying, we came up with these eugenics ideas in America, but we don't have the courage to actually do what you're doing. That's the mayor of Chicago. You'll see that. So again, that's why when I saw that story this week, Shane, I was like, well, that can't be true. But then you look at the history and you look at our historical ignorance and you think, this is actually a believable headline, and we need to condemn it. Now, again, it's unproven. We don't know where this allegation. I'm not just talking about that. I'm talking about we have that history, and to forget that history, very, very dangerous thing.
Amen. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back after this to talk about more of the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. Stay with us. We're back on Breakpoint this week, talking about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. And John, easily the biggest story of the week internationally here was a peace deal that went down between the United States, Israel, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain, right there in Washington, D.C. at the White House. President Trump presided over the signing of a Middle East peace agreement between these nations, calling it a foundation for a broader alignment against Iran that would fundamentally change the geopolitical dynamic throughout the Middle East. The so-called Abraham Accords, I love the name, very interesting, brokered and signed by the U.S., Israel, and the UAE and Bahrain, normalizes relations between these nations. Basically, what that means is that they're recognizing Israel's legitimacy, and they're going to start treating them according to the rules of normal diplomacy, which is it's fairly historic, because the Arab nations throughout the Middle East have been pretty much aligned up till now in not recognizing the legitimacy of Israel and normalizing diplomatic relations with her. Now, a couple more have. So let's talk about the implications of that, because it's a huge story in a volatile region.
Yeah, and that's the story. One of the stories of the story is that it wasn't a story when it should have been a story for so many media outlets. There was a remarkable silence on this accomplishment, and it is an accomplishment. I think it's Secretary of State Pompeo has delivered a home run here for the Trump administration and for foreign policy. When one thinks like something like this hasn't actually happened since, any sort of advance, any sort of step has not happened since the Clinton administration when it comes to Middle East peace. Now, one can also go, oh, well, what happens, between the Clinton administration and today on that? And yeah, 9/11 and, the overall conflict that created in the instability in the Middle East and certainly, Israel and so on. This also underscores at some level, Shane, that, the thing we've been saying, elections matter. I mean, our listeners might remember how many elections that the nation of Israel has had just in the last year because of Netanyahu's, issues, as well as him winning and then not winning and then winning. That if that doesn't come out the way that it does, then these peace agreements, these I guess a peace agreement it's really much more of a recognition of nations and a trade arrangement, right? So in other words, it's more than just let's not kill each other. It's let's actually acknowledge each other as legitimate players, which for predominantly Arab countries to recognize Israel, that's a huge step. The other thing, which obviously remains to be seen, but would make this even more significant, is the president has, in an interview, said that there's 6 or 7, 8 or 9, in his famously imprecise way, that there's a bunch of other nations that are lined up. Now, obviously, none of them are going to be Iran, but there's a whole host of other nations that if they line up on this, it's going to make an enormous difference. And it's actually going to build a sort of alliance against Iran, which right now, of course, is the primary cause of the instability that's there and the threat against Israel. So look, there's some evangelicals that are going to see prophetic fulfillments on this. I think that what we can actually know here is that on a geopolitical scale, this is going to bring a stability. This is great for the nation of Israel. The president's relationship with the nation of Israel has been extremely important and extremely strong. And this will easily be, and we can at least say this, and again, we don't know how many more nations are going to sign up or what's going to happen, but this will easily be the pinnacle of foreign policy achievement for the Trump administration. And it's no small thing. It is a remarkable thing that it was so underplayed in so many mainstream media outlets.
Yeah, as Molly Hemingway said on Twitter, has anybody noticed that peace is breaking out in the Middle East? I mean, it was underplayed, and I say it's the biggest story of the week because it should be the biggest story of the week, not necessarily because it was dominant in the headlines.
It earned the president his second Nobel Peace Prize nomination. He had one, and that gave him his second one. Now, there's not a chance that he's going to win it, but there is something to be said that if this happened under an Obama administration, that we would certainly have heard about it a lot more.
Yeah, I'm no foreign policy wonk, John, but I understand that the nations involved in this send a particularly important signal, especially about Saudi Arabia, who's the giant in the region,
Right.
because Saudi Arabia would have had to in some way sign off on this for the nations that were involved to be involved. So it raises questions about whether Saudi Arabia now is going to normalize relations with Israel, and if so, could that be the the domino that knocks over the whole Middle East and toward peace? And it's disorienting in a way, in a wonderful way, because for me, only being 31 years old, I look back and it just seems like the entire history of the Middle East in my lifetime has been conflict after conflict, and punctuated by 9/11 and then an occasional failed peace agreement brokered by a U.S. president. But this shows signs of being something, a hopeful step toward real peace in the region. And I mean, peace is always worth celebrating for humanitarian reasons, yes, but also because it facilitates the spread of the gospel. It's not easy to evangelize in wartime, and I have heard missionaries describe the importance of regional stability and peace, and so that's something that I would be praying for in the midst of watching this go down.
Yeah, absolutely. It's good news.
We're rolling into our final segment here on Breakpoint this week for the online podcast. We're going to talk about recommendations. So I'll go first here, John. My recommendation this week is actually a book that I have been assigned in my systematic theology class in seminary, and I'm really enjoying it. It's Fred Sanders' The Deep Things of God, How the Trinity Changes Everything. And he talks about how the Trinity strikes many evangelicals as an awkward add-on in our faith, as sort of a mysterious, undigested lump of archaic doctrine that we're just supposed to accept because it's in the Nicene Creed, but we're not really sure where it fits into the broad picture of salvation and conversion and all that. And Sanders goes through in this beautiful way and just shows how, well, two things. First of all, he shows how evangelicals have what he calls implicit knowledge of the Trinity. So he says that the evangelical who talks about conversion, who talks about the work of the Spirit, who talks about who's cruciocentric, as it's been called, who focuses on the atonement and the work of Christ on the cross, that person is implicitly very Trinitarian. They're invoking concepts that find their origin in the three persons, one nature of God. And I love that concept. The second thing he talks about is how our theology actually historically as evangelicals affords a tremendous wealth of Trinitarian thinking. And he actually says, I'll go toe to toe with any other tradition who thinks that they're more Trinitarian than evangelicals are historically. And it's quite a gauntlet to throw down, but his treatment of it is very convincing because of his the historical writings of evangelical authors that he invokes, and the way he shows the Trinity in every doctrine of Christianity, and the most beloved doctrines of evangelicals, salvation, revelation, scripture itself, prayer, conversion, you name it. The Trinity is there. It's at the center of all of it. So I recommend that because I'm convinced thoroughly by his argument, and I think that we as evangelicals need desperately to rediscover the central place of the Trinity in our doctrine and thinking.
It's a funny recommendation or timing of it. My daughter brought home a question from her, let's see, what grade? 6th grade class, saying, what difference does the Trinity make? So it was a teacher asking 6th graders to come up with that answer. And I was like trying to walk it through, and she's like, "Is it like this?" And I was like, "No, sorry, that's a heresy." "Is it like this?" "No, sorry, that's a heresy."
As soon as you say the Trinity is like, you're getting into to deep waters.
It's the only thing where the analogies. It's the only thing where the analogies are so helpful because they don't work, not because they do work, right? Because you say, okay, what's like an egg, but it's really not. It's like I'm a father, a boss, and a dad. Or a husband, but that doesn't work either.
That's modalism, Patrick.
Yeah, that's right. It's just one after another. I used to, when I taught intro to theology at a little Christian college, I would start any segment on the Trinity, and I'd say, before we begin, I'm just going to go ahead and pray, and we're going to confess that we're going to be heretics, by the end of this, because you can't talk about this. I like John Stott's answer. He said, whenever you talk about this, take your shoes off because you're standing on holy ground. So.
Well, he was, I'll say this too. Sanders is really good about that because he says that, you shouldn't be afraid of accidentally becoming a heretic, because heresy is defined as obstinate
Right.
obstinate error. It's, persisting in something that you have accountability for realizing is an error, and you persist in it. So, if you accidentally stumble into something and you have a correctable spirit about it, that's not heresy. So I would encourage people to talk about God even if they're no good at it. That was actually the title of a column I did a while back.
Yeah. Well, I tell you, and if you want help, and I'm supposed to give other recommendations. I already have two lined up but there's a chapter, book 4 in Augustine's Confessions is his reflection on God. And it's one of the most remarkable ways. And it's a good thing to read before you start thinking through these things, because he puts you on a different plane. One of the problems, as we were talking with my kids about the Trinity, is that we think about persons and the relationship of beings and persons from a human perspective. So we're trying to understand God through a lens of human. And the whole point of the scripture is to understand all of life through the lens of God, right? Including ourselves and the relationship between beings and persons. And it's just not the same thing. So I'm grateful when I first read that book 4 from Augustine's Confessions, when he's like, what is God? He goes, woe to me if I talk about him. And yet when I talk about him, I'm completely wrong. And it's this wonderful kind of humble, yet the water is going to be crazy, but jump in anyway, sort of take, which is great. All right. Well, I've got 2 recommendations this week. One is because I should have given it last week and I forgot, the week of 9/11. This is an annual 9/11 read for me, September the 11th, when we remember this. It's a remarkable piece of his timetable journalism in Politico magazine. It's actually been turned into a book, and I'm grateful for whoever on Twitter, when I posted this, said, oh, hey, did you know this was a book? And I was like, no, and I bought it. So I'm grateful for that because it's got some wonderful images and some really telling things. And I'm looking forward to using this book to tell the story of 9/11 to my kids, although it's like a $30 book. So thanks for that. Anyway, the article is called We're the Only Plane in the Sky. It was by Garrett Graff. It dates from 2016, so 5 years after 15 years after 9/11. It literally is a minute by minute history. I sent it to a good friend of mine, and he was going to read it on one of his app readers or whatever, and he texted me back. He goes, it says this is a 72-minute read, and I was like, well, it is about 9/11, so yes, it is a 72-minute read, but it's eyewitness accounts minute by minute. So think about eyewitness accounts, think about the minute by minute timetable, and he tells the story through these eyewitness accounts. It is a remarkable feat of writing, and it should be my annual recommendation every 9/11. So I missed it last week because we recorded on 9/10, and it didn't occur to me until the next morning, and I was like, oh, this should have been my recommendation. The other thing that I want to recommend, just given our conversation earlier about the number of Americans who are not clear on what really the Holocaust was about, is the 75th anniversary edition of The Definitive History of the White Rose, which, if you don't know about this, it was a group of students at the University of Munich who lived out their faith in opposing Adolf Hitler, paid for it with their lives. They published a series of pamphlets that they distributed around the campus and nearby communities. 2 things that I did not realize. The first thing that I did not realize was the journeys that each of the individual members of the White Rose went on, including Sophie Scholl herself, to reach the point of, crossing a line. And that's how the author kinds of put it, Hans and
Crossing a line, meaning
from, so yeah, that's such a great question. Basically from believing to acting, from thinking away to acting. There's this scene that's described in there when Hans Scholl goes to a meeting where other people who are either frustrated with Hitler or the Nazis or the way that, the local SS was running things or whatever, and they're talking about, hey, this is wrong and here's all the reasons it's wrong. And Hans says really cynically, well, maybe we should just get together and have a worldview class on how bad everything is. And it's a stunning thing as an advocate of worldview. And I forgot, you kind of forget that worldview itself was a product of German philosophy. Immanuel Kant was the first one to use the word. And so when Hanscho is using it, it's a very common, Weltanschauung is a very common idea, basically the mental categories and his frustration there. And you can actually see this emerge in Dietrich Bonhoeffer's writings of seeing what drives us is fundamentally our categories of thought and not our habits and not our relationships and not our context and not our passions. And this is some of the ways I think that worldview has been corrected. So that's what he means when they say this, they've crossed the line. It's like there's no going back. But there's also that very much a reality of making a decision like that you can't go back at that point, right? I mean, it's over. And you see how stunning it is that within 4 days, these students are caught, arrested, tried, convicted, and executed by guillotine. 4 days. Sophie and Hanscho's parents go back to their home and try to start filing appeals, not even knowing that within 2 hours, both Hans and Sophie had been executed by guillotine. It's just a stunning book. So it's called Sophie Scholl and the White Rose. It's the 75th anniversary book. It is a remarkable work. You can actually read the here's the other thing I was going to say about this, Shane, that I did not realize too, is just to the extent that those pamphlets ended up having. So the very last pamphlet that was distributed before the one when they got caught, that eventually was reprinted and shared, and it went to the British Royal Navy, who printed up a bunch of copies and then dropped it from their planes all across Germany. So you know that they'd influenced the city of Berlin and the university, the city of Munich and the university there, but it ended up being a document to continue to cause the unrest all across Germany. And that somehow that was a detail that I had missed. But anyway, Sophie Scholl and the White Rose, it's a remarkable history of students who found their faith colliding with their culture. And I'll end with this quote from Sophie Scholl as she was defending herself in front of this notorious judge who just harangued them and yelled at them all the way through their trial. And she said, "Hey, somebody after all had to make a start." What a remarkable line. Somebody had to do something. And so we did.
And how do we remember her? The memory of the righteous is a blessing, but the name of the wicked will rot, says Proverbs. And that is absolutely
that's the story of this. If I've ever heard a proverb
remember
applied.
Those who resisted evil, even in the face of apparently overwhelming odds.
It's amazing. It's an amazing story.
And what an appropriate recommendation too, in light of what we talked about earlier with the ignorance of the horrors of the Holocaust and the extent of it among young people in the U.S.
Absolutely.
Well, that wraps it up for today, folks. Come to breakpoint.org for links to all of the stories that John and I have mentioned today on the program, as well as daily worldview commentary and resources to help you think and live as a Christian in today's culture. For John Stonestreet and for the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris. Thanks so much for listening.